There's a moment right before you open your eyes in the morning when the world doesn't exist yet. Not philosophically, not poetically, literally. Quantum mechanics, the most rigorously tested scientific framework in human history, accurate to 1 part in a trillion, describes reality as a superposition of all possible states simultaneously. Everything that could happen is technically happening, overlapping, coexisting in a kind of probabilistic fog. The particle isn't here or there. It's everywhere at once, until something looks at it. Then it collapses. One possibility wins, the others vanish, and the world, for one more moment, becomes specific. Now here's the question that should keep you up at night. If reality collapses into a single state only when it's observed, what exactly are you collapsing it into? Because you've been looking at your life every single day. You've been observing your relationships, your health, your sense of what's possible for someone like you. And if the physics is telling us anything worth taking seriously, that observation isn't passive, it isn't neutral, it isn't just recording what's there, it's selecting. What if the most dangerous thing you do every day is look? That question is going to stay open for a while, not because the answer is complicated, because the answer requires you to arrive at it yourself, and arriving at it too early would ruin what it actually means. What this video is not is another repackaging of the law of attraction with scientific vocabulary borrowed to make it sound credible. What it is something harder. An investigation into what quantum mechanics actually says, not the metaphor, the physics, and what the unavoidable implications of that physics might mean for the life of someone who has spent decades observing the world in a particular way without ever questioning whether the observation itself was part of the problem. This isn't about thinking positively. This isn't about vibrating at a higher frequency. This is about structure. The structure of reality, the structure of observation, and the structure of the self that has been doing the observing, possibly since before you understood you were doing it at all. There's a specific terror that comes with the idea that you've been shaping something without knowing it, not the terror of catastrophe. The quieter, more personal terror of realizing that what you thought was a neutral record of experience was actually a set of choices, made automatically, repeatedly, invisibly, and that the world you've been living in is, in some measurable sense, the accumulated result of a gaze you never chose to examine. That's what this is about, and if that feels slightly too large to hold right now, good. That means the question is the right size. Stay with it. Let's start with what the science actually says, not the pop version, not the version that ends up on motivational posters, but the version that made physicists in the early 20th century deeply, personally unsettled in ways they didn't always admit publicly. In 1927, a group of the most consequential scientific minds in history gathered in Brussels for the 5th Solvay Conference. Einstein was there. Bohr was there. Heisenberg, Schrödinger, Pauli, the people who had dismantled classical physics and were now standing in the rubble, trying to figure out what they'd built instead. And the problem they were circling, the one that kept refusing to resolve itself cleanly, was deceptively simple. What happens to a quantum system when no one is looking at it? The answer they arrived at, not happily, not unanimously, but mathematically, was that it doesn't have a definite state. Not, we don't know its state. Not, it has a state, but we can't measure it yet with our current instruments. The quantum system genuinely physically exists in multiple contradictory states simultaneously. A particle can be spinning up and spinning down at the same time. An electron can be on the left side of a barrier and the right side at once. This isn't a limitation of our instruments. This is what the equations describe, and the equations have never been wrong. The technical name for this is superposition, the coexistence of mutually exclusive possibilities before measurement. Superposition means all options at once, until something forces a choice. And what forces the choice? Observation, more specifically, what physicists call measurement. Any interaction with the environment that extracts information from a system. When a particle is measured, its wave function, the mathematical object describing the full spread of all its possible states, collapses. The fog becomes a point. The probability becomes a fact. What was potential becomes actual, not observed, not real in any definite sense. Now, this is the moment where most explanations try to reassure you. Don't worry, they say. This only applies to subatomic particles. The everyday world is too large and too warm for quantum effects to matter at a human scale. Your coffee mug isn't in superposition. And that reassurance is reasonable, at one scale, but it avoids the question that Niels Bohr, the architect of what became known as the Copenhagen interpretation, never fully answered. The Copenhagen interpretation, the dominant framework for understanding quantum mechanics for nearly a century, says that the wave function collapses upon measurement. It says observation creates definite reality from probabilistic potential. What it does not say, what it famously refuses to say, is where the boundary lies between the quantum world and the classical one. Where does superposition end? Where does the observer begin? That silence is not an oversight, it's the crack in the foundation. Because if you press the question, if you follow the logic of quantum mechanics all the way up the chain instead of stopping it at a convenient point, you arrive somewhere deeply strange. You arrive at a conclusion that the mathematician and physicist John von Neumann laid out in meticulous formal detail in 1932, in a work that most people have never encountered, but that quietly restructured everything that came after it. Von Neumann showed that if you take quantum mechanics seriously, if you refuse to arbitrarily draw a line between the quantum particle and the measuring device, then the measuring device itself enters superposition. It becomes entangled with the particle it was supposed to be measuring. And then the scientist looking at the measuring device becomes entangled too, and then the room, and then the building, and then, logically, inevitably, you. Entanglement, the technical term for a quantum connection in which two systems can no longer be described independently of each other, regardless of physical distance, doesn't stop at the laboratory door. Von Neumann's mathematics says it keeps going, all the way up. No natural stopping point. This is called the von Neumann chain, the infinite regress of entanglement that quantum mechanics produces when you refuse to insert a classical boundary where the math doesn't actually support one. And it matters enormously, because the chain has no internal mechanism that terminates it. Something has to stop it. Something has to be the final observer, the point at which superposition collapses into one definite outcome. Von Neumann's own conclusion, which he did not reach lightly, was that the only thing that sits outside the physical chain, the only thing that doesn't itself require another observer to collapse it, is consciousness. Not a detector, not a camera, not a computer. A conscious mind. Now this is where physicists diverge sharply, and where intellectual honesty requires us to say clearly, von Neumann's interpretation is contested. There are other interpretations of quantum mechanics, the many worlds interpretation, decoherence-based accounts, relational quantum mechanics, that don't require consciousness to play a special role. The debate is not settled. Anyone who tells you it is settled in either direction is selling you something. But here's what is settled. The question of who counts as an observer is one of the most genuinely open, most consequential, most philosophically loaded questions in the entire history of science, and most people go their entire lives without knowing it exists. That is the problem this video is really about. Not particles, not laboratories, not the technical minutiae of wave function collapse. The problem is this: if the act of observation is not passive, if looking at a system is not simply recording what was already there, but is instead participating in what becomes real, then something fundamental changes about how you understand your own experience. Because you are not a scientist in a laboratory, you are not measuring electrons, but you are an observer, and you have been observing something far more consequential than particles. You have been observing your own life. Every day, for decades, with instruments far less neutral than you probably assumed. This resolves the basic physics setup, but it creates a problem that is significantly larger than the one it solves. If conscious systems participate in collapsing reality, if the act of looking is not passive but generative, then reality is never neutral. It is always already shaped by whoever is doing the looking. And that should change something fundamental about how you understand the world you've been inhabiting. But we're not there yet. First, we need to go to the experiment. There is one experiment in the history of science that has been called, without serious challenge, the most beautiful experiment ever performed. It has also been called the most disturbing. Richard Feynman, Nobel Prize winner, one of the greatest physicists of the 20th century, a man not given to dramatic overstatement, said that it contains the only real mystery of quantum mechanics. That if you understood it deeply enough, you understood everything genuinely strange about the quantum world. It's called the double-slit experiment. Here is what happens. You take a source of particles, electrons, photons, or even entire molecules, and you fire them one at a time at a barrier with two narrow slits cut into it. Behind the barrier is a detector screen that records where each particle lands. Now, if particles behaved like tiny bullets, you would expect them to pass through one slit or the other and create two bands on the screen directly behind each slit. Simple, intuitive, classical. That is not what happens. When no one is measuring which slit the particle goes through, the particles land in an interference pattern, a series of alternating bands of high and low density that can only be explained if each individual particle traveled through both slits simultaneously and interfered with itself, as a wave would, as a probability cloud would, as something fundamentally non-local and non-definite would. The particle, unobserved, behaves as if it is everywhere it could possibly be at once. Then you watch. You add a detector at the slits, any device capable of registering which path the particle actually took. You don't change the particle, you don't touch it differently or alter its trajectory, you simply make it possible to know which slit it went through, and the interference pattern disappears. The moment information about the particle's path becomes available to the universe, the moment observation becomes possible, even if no human being ever actually looks at the data, the particle stops behaving like a wave and starts behaving like a particle. It picks a slit. It lands in one of two bands. Classical, definite, located reality reasserts itself, not because anything physical changed in the particle, because knowledge entered the system. The act of observation collapsed the superposition. Take a breath here, because what this means is not subtle and it does not have a comfortable interpretation. It means that the behavior of matter is not independent of whether it is being observed. Reality, at the level where the fundamental rules are written, is observer-dependent. Not metaphorically, mathematically. Now here is where most explanations stop, and where the real vertigo begins. In 1978, John Archibald Wheeler, the physicist who coined the term black hole and was one of Einstein's closest intellectual collaborators, proposed a thought experiment so radical that it took decades before the technology existed to test it. He called it the delayed choice experiment. The setup is a variation on the double slit, but Wheeler added something that shouldn't be possible if our ordinary intuitions about time and causality are even approximately correct. He proposed that you could wait until after the particle had already passed through the slits, after it had already presumably committed to a path, and then decide, in that moment after the fact, whether or not to observe which path it took. The prediction was that this retroactive choice would determine how the particle had behaved in the past, not how it would behave going forward, how it had already behaved. The experiment was confirmed in laboratories multiple times, most definitively in 2007, by a research team at the Australian National University. The results were exactly as strange as Wheeler predicted. If you chose to observe the path after the particle had already passed through, the particle behaved as though it had traveled through one slit, no interference pattern. If you chose not to observe, the interference pattern appeared, as if the particle had always been traveling as a wave through both slits simultaneously. Your decision, made after the fact, retroactively determined how the particle had behaved in the past. Let that settle for a moment. The future observation reaches back. Wheeler described this with a phrase that has never stopped being unsettling to anyone who takes it seriously. The past has no existence except as it is recorded in the present. Not as a poetic flourish, not as a philosophical provocation designed to sound interesting at dinner parties, as a physical statement about what the mathematics of quantum mechanics actually requires us to accept. This is not fringe science. This is not a misinterpretation by someone eager to make physics sound mystical. This is peer-reviewed, experimentally replicated, mathematically grounded physics, and it tells us that the relationship between observer and observed is not a fixed line drawn somewhere in a laboratory. It is dynamic, it is participatory, it reaches, apparently even through time. Wheeler eventually stopped describing the universe as a machine that runs independently of the observers within it. He began calling it a participatory universe, one that is, in some irreducible sense, brought into being through the act of observation itself, not created from nothing, but specified, pulled from the fog of superposition into the clarity of definite fact, by the act of looking. Now here is where the standard science communication stops, and here is where this conversation refuses to. Because if you've been following carefully, you've noticed that every single one of these experiments, the double-slit, the von Neumann chain, Wheeler's delayed choice, converges on the same point. Not the same conclusion, because physicists still argue ferociously about what the conclusions mean philosophically, but the same fact. The fact that reality is not a fixed stage upon which observers stand as passive audience members, watching a show that would have run exactly the same way without them. Not a stage, a collaboration. And the collaboration doesn't pause while you figure out whether you believe in it. It doesn't wait for your philosophical consent. The math doesn't offer an exemption for the intuition that your perception is just neutrally recording what's already there. The most tested scientific framework in human history, the one that underlies semiconductors, lasers, MRI machines, the very device you're watching this on right now, is built on the foundational premise that what is observed and the act of observing are not cleanly separable. They never were. This resolves the objection that quantum mechanics is being used here as mere metaphor. The experimental record is real. The mathematics is real. The implications are real, even if their full meaning remains contested among the people most qualified to contest it. But resolving that objection creates a problem significantly larger than the one it solved. Because if observation shapes reality at the level where the fundamental rules are written, if looking is not passive but participatory, then the question that follows isn't a physics question anymore. It's a personal one. What have you been participating in? What has your gaze been selecting? Not once in a laboratory, not as a thought experiment, but every morning, every conversation, every time you looked at your own circumstances and decided in the space of a breath what kind of world you were living in and what kind of person you were inside it. That question doesn't have a scientific answer. It has only your answer. And that's where we go next. You run an experiment every morning. You probably don't call it that. You call it waking up. You call it getting ready, checking your phone, drinking your coffee, deciding how you feel before the day has technically started. But structurally, if we take seriously what the physics has been pointing toward, it functions like a measurement. It functions like a collapse. Before the day is observed, it exists in superposition. Not literally in the quantum mechanical sense. We are not claiming your Tuesday morning is a subatomic system. But the pattern operates at a scale you can actually feel, and it operates with a consistency that should give you pause. Before you've brought your expectations, your history, your trained sense of what tends to happen to someone like you, the day is genuinely open. Multiple versions of it are possible. The conversation with your partner could go a dozen different ways. The work problem you've been carrying could resolve itself or deepen. The stranger you pass on the street could become significant or invisible. The same external facts could land as evidence that things are slowly getting better, or as confirmation that they never really do. Then you observe, and something collapses. Not because the day forced it. Because your gaze, loaded with everything you've accumulated about what reality is like for someone with your particular history, landed on the open field of possibility and selected, automatically, efficiently, in the same direction it has been selecting for years. The observer was already running before you were fully awake. This is not a metaphor designed to make you feel bad. It's a structural description of something that cognitive science has been documenting from a completely different direction for decades. The brain, it turns out, is not primarily a recording device. It is a prediction engine. Neuroscientists call this the predictive processing framework, the model in which the brain constantly generates expectations about what it's about to perceive and then filters incoming sensory data through those expectations, updating only when the mismatch between prediction and reality is too large to ignore. In plain terms, you don't see what's there, you see what you predicted would be there, corrected slightly by what actually showed up. Your perception is not a window. It is a negotiation between expectation and evidence, and expectation has the home advantage, which means that the observer you bring to each day is not neutral, it is not blank. It arrives preloaded with a model of what the world is like, what you are like inside it, and what range of outcomes is realistic for someone in your position. And it filters everything through that model before you've had a single conscious thought about it. Now connect this back to physics. In the double-slit experiment, the interference pattern disappears the moment a detector is placed at the slits, not because the detector does anything violent to the particle, but because the possibility of knowing changes what becomes real. The particle responds to the informational structure of its environment. It responds to whether the setup is one in which its path could be known. Your days respond to something similar. Not to the facts of your circumstances. Those are more malleable than you've probably been told. They respond to the informational structure you bring to them, to whether your observational setup is one that could register the unexpected, the contradictory, the evidence that doesn't fit the model, or whether it's a setup so tuned to confirming what you already believe that novelty simply doesn't survive contact with your attention. What does your default gaze actually select for? This is not a rhetorical question meant to shame you into better habits. It is a genuine structural inquiry, and it has a specific, answerable form. Think about the last time something genuinely surprised you in a good way. Something that contradicted your expectations about how your life tends to go. How long ago was it? How quickly did you explain it away, attribute it to luck, treat it as an exception rather than as data that might require you to update the model? Because the speed with which you absorb the anomaly back into the familiar pattern, is a measure of your observer's rigidity. A rigid observer doesn't produce a rigid world through magic. It produces one through selection. It notices the confirming evidence and processes it deeply. It registers the disconfirming evidence and routes it around the central model. Over time, the world that gets built up in experience isn't the world that exists. It's the world that was allowed through the filter. Not reality. A curated version of it. And the curation has been running so long, so automatically, so beneath the threshold of conscious choice that it stopped feeling like curation. It started feeling like just the way things are. Here's the concrete version of this. Think of someone you know, or perhaps think of yourself, who has held a particular belief about their own limitations for a long time. Not a dramatic belief, a quiet one. Something like, people like me don't tend to get lasting financial stability or close relationships, always become complicated after a certain point. Or I'm someone who starts things but doesn't finish them. These beliefs don't announce themselves as beliefs. They present themselves as observations, as patterns noticed honestly over time, as the reasonable conclusion of an attentive person who has been paying attention. But they are not observations. They are the observer. They are the detector placed at the slit. And once they're in place, the interference pattern, the open wave-like spread of possibility, collapses. Not because possibility disappeared, because the measurement apparatus decided in advance what it was looking for and found it, reliably, every time. The belief didn't describe your life, it selected it. Not observation, authorship. And this is where the personal application of physics stops being comfortable, because it carries an implication that most people would prefer to avoid. If your observer has been selecting, if your expectations have been functioning as a measurement apparatus that collapses possibility into a specific and recurring pattern, then the world you've been experiencing is not simply what happened to you. It is, in some meaningful and measurable sense, what you've been looking for. Not consciously, not deliberately, not with any intention to limit yourself, but structurally, functionally, with the same impersonal efficiency that a detector at the double slit produces a collapsed particle, your observer has been doing its job, collapsing the open field of your days into the specific, recurring shape of your expectations. This resolves the gap between abstract physics and lived experience. But it creates a problem that is significantly larger than the one it closes. Because if the observer is running the collapse, if the measurement apparatus is generating the pattern, then the obvious question is, can you change it? Can you place a different detector at the slit? Can you reconfigure the observational setup so that a wider range of possibilities survives contact with your attention? And the answer is yes. But the answer comes with a condition that most conversations about this topic quietly omit. You cannot change the observer while leaving the observer intact. What that means, and why it matters more than anything else this video will say, is where we go next. Here is the part that most people aren't prepared for. Not the idea that observation shapes reality. That part, once you've followed physics carefully, has a kind of elegant logic to it. Strange, yes. Uncomfortable, certainly. But it has the quality of a puzzle that, once you see it, makes a certain kind of sense. The part that most people aren't prepared for is the next question. The one that follows inevitably once you've accepted that your observer has been selecting your reality. The question is, where did the observer come from? Because the observer isn't you, not in the deepest sense. The observer is something that was built, assembled over years, over decades, through a process that began before you had the cognitive architecture to evaluate what was being installed. It was constructed from the emotional climate of your earliest environment, from what the significant people around you modeled about what the world was like and what you were inside it, from the conclusions you drew, rapidly necessarily with the limited interpretive tools of a developing mind, from experiences that happened to you before you could contextualize them. The observer was built under conditions you did not choose, from materials you did not select according to a blueprint you were never shown, and then it was handed to you as if it were you. Not a tool you were given, a self you were told you had. This is where the physics and the psychology converge in a way that is genuinely unsettling. Not because either field is being stretched beyond its legitimate domain, but because they arrive independently at the same structure. Quantum mechanics tells us that the observer determines what becomes real. Developmental psychology, and specifically the body of work that has accumulated around attachment theory, predictive processing, and the neuroscience of early experience, tells us that the observer is itself a product of prior observations, of what you learned to see when you were small enough that seeing and believing were the same act. The technical term in cognitive science for the deep structure of these learned observational patterns is a schema, a mental framework, largely unconscious, that organizes incoming information by routing it through categories established by prior experience. Schemas are not passive filing systems, they are active filters. They determine what gets noticed, what gets elaborated, what gets remembered, and what gets quietly discarded before it ever reaches conscious awareness. You have schemas about relationships, about money, about your own capability, about what people like you, says with your background, your history, your particular constellation of formative experiences, can reasonably expect from the world. And those schemas are your observer, running continuously below the level of conscious thought, collapsing the superposition of your days into the same recurring pattern with the same impersonal efficiency as a detector at a double-slit experiment. But here is where it gets genuinely terrifying, not in a sensational way, in the quiet, specific way that real terror operates, the kind that arrives not as a shock, but as a slow recognition of something that was always true. The terrifying part is not that your observer has a bias. Every observer has a bias. The instrument always shapes the measurement. This is true in physics, true in psychology, true in every domain where something is being looked at by something else. Bias in an observer is not a flaw. It is a structural feature of what observation is. The terrifying part is that the bias is invisible to itself. A camera doesn't know it has a lens, a scale doesn't know it needs calibration, and an observer, a human observational apparatus assembled from decades of experience and encoded into neural architecture that operates mostly beneath conscious access, doesn't naturally know that it's selecting. It experiences its selections as perceptions. It experiences its filters as clarity. It experiences the recurring pattern it produces, not as a pattern it created, but as a pattern it discovered. This is not a character flaw. This is not a failure of intelligence or self-awareness. Some of the most perceptive, most intellectually sophisticated people you will ever meet are running observers with profound biases, and running them with the full, unquestioned confidence of people who believe they are simply seeing clearly. The philosopher Immanuel Kant spent the better part of a decade working through a version of this problem in the 18th century. His conclusion, arrived at through pure philosophical reasoning, without access to anything resembling modern neuroscience or quantum mechanics, was that we never perceive reality directly. We perceive reality as processed through the categories of our own cognitive apparatus. Space, time, causality, these are not features of the world that we passively detect. They are structures that the mind imposes on experience in order to make it legible. Kant called the world as it actually is, independent of any observer, the Ding an sich, the thing in itself. And he argued with careful and devastating logic that the thing in itself is permanently inaccessible to us. We cannot step outside our own observational apparatus to see what reality looks like without it. We can only ever see the reality our apparatus produces. Now hold that next to what Wheeler said about the participatory universe, that the universe is brought into definite being through the act of observation, and something clicks into place that should change the texture of your daily experience. It's not just that you can't see reality neutrally, it's that there may be no neutral reality waiting to be seen. What becomes real, what collapses out of the superposition of possibility into the specificity of your actual lived experience, is shaped at every level by the instrument doing the collapsing. And the instrument is you, or rather, and this distinction is everything. The instrument is what you were made into before you were old enough to have a say in the making. Not who you are, who you were trained to see as yourself. This is the second peak of this conversation, and it requires sitting rather than immediately resolving, because the instinct when you arrive here is to ask for the solution, to want the practical steps, the framework, the method by which you recalibrate the observer and install a better one, and that instinct is understandable. It is also, in a specific way, a product of the same observer that created the problem, the part of you that has learned to route discomfort through action before the discomfort has been fully understood. Because here is what the physics actually suggests, taken seriously. You cannot change the observer from inside the observer's own framework. You cannot use the biased instrument to accurately measure its own bias. This is not a motivational obstacle. It is a logical one. The same schemas that filter your perception of the external world also filter your perception of yourself. The same predictive apparatus that decides what your Tuesday morning means also decides what your introspective attempts at self-examination mean. You look inward with the same instrument you look outward with, which means that changing the observer is not a matter of trying harder, thinking more carefully, or adopting better mental habits while leaving the underlying structure intact. It requires something more fundamental. It requires, and this is where the physics metaphor reaches its most precise application, a change in the measurement apparatus itself. Not an adjustment, not a recalibration of the existing instrument, a genuine structural change in what is doing the observing, which means inevitably a period in which the old observer has to become uncertain of itself before the new one can stabilize. In quantum mechanics, there is a concept that maps onto this with uncomfortable precision. It's called decoherence, the process by which a quantum system loses its superposition, its openness to multiple simultaneous states through interaction with its environment. Decoherence is what happens when the quantum world transitions into the classical one. It is the mechanism by which possibility becomes fixed fact. But decoherence runs in both directions in human experience. The observer that has become too fixed, too classical, too collapsed into a single rigid interpretation of what the world is and what you are inside it, can, under the right conditions, begin to decohere in reverse, to open, to become uncertain in the productive sense, to recover some of the superposition it lost when it was assembled under pressure, before it had the luxury of remaining open. This is not the same as confusion. It is not the same as a crisis. Though it can feel like both, because an observer that has been running a collapsed fixed pattern for decades will experience the introduction of genuine openness as destabilizing, as threatening, as something to be resolved back into certainty as quickly as possible. The resistance you feel to sitting with uncertainty is not weakness. It is the old observer defending its own existence. Because if the observer changes, if the measurement apparatus genuinely reconfigures, then the world it produces will change. And the identity built around interpreting that world, the self-concept assembled from decades of experiencing a particular pattern of collapsed reality, will no longer have the same ground to stand on. This is why genuine change at this level is rare. Not because people lack motivation, not because they haven't tried, but because the thing doing the trying is the thing that needs to change, and it will resist its own transformation with every tool available to it, including the very intelligence and self-awareness that make a person capable of having this conversation in the first place. The philosopher Alan Watts described this bind with characteristic precision. The problem with self-improvement is that the self doing the improving is the problem. He wasn't being cynical. He was being structurally accurate. And William James, the American philosopher and psychologist who spent his life at the intersection of consciousness and experience, arrived at something similar from a different direction. James argued that genuine transformation of character doesn't come from resolving to be different. It comes from what he called a change in the empirical self, the felt, lived sense of who you are, which happens not through willpower, but through new experience that the old observer cannot fully process back into its existing categories. Experience that doesn't fit, evidence that can't be routed around, a moment of genuine surprise, of reality behaving in a way that the existing model cannot absorb without cracking. This is what Wheeler's delayed choice experiment suggests about the observer, taken as a metaphor for human transformation rather than a description of particle physics. The act of choosing to look differently, choosing to become the kind of observer who is open to a different range of outcomes, doesn't just change what you see going forward, it reaches back retroactively and begins to reinterpret what has already happened. Events that were filed as evidence of one pattern begin to look like evidence of another. The past doesn't change its facts, but its meaning, which was never a fixed feature of the facts themselves, but always a product of the observer processing them, shifts, not rewriting history, recollapsing it. The same events, processed through a different observational apparatus, produce a different experiential record, a different story. They're a different sense of what has been true about you and what therefore remains possible. This resolves the question of whether change is possible. It is, but it creates the largest problem this conversation has yet produced. Because knowing this, understanding it intellectually, following the argument, nodding at the physics and the philosophy and the psychology, changes almost nothing on its own. Knowing that your observer has a bias doesn't recalibrate the observer. Knowing that your measurement apparatus was assembled under conditions you didn't choose doesn't dismantle it. Understanding the structure of the trap is not the same as being free of it. And this is the point at which most conversations about consciousness, about quantum mechanics, about the nature of perception and reality, end with understanding, with insight, with the satisfying click of a well-constructed idea landing in the mind of someone intelligent enough to appreciate it. And then nothing changes, because the observer that received the insight processed it through its existing framework, filed it under "interesting things I now know," and went back to collapsing the same pattern the next morning with the same efficiency it always had. Insight without structural change is decoration. This is not pessimism. It is the most important distinction this entire conversation has been building toward. And it's where we need to stop explaining and start talking directly. Let me step out of the explanation for a moment, because there's a specific kind of person who watches a video like this, and I think I know something about who you are. Not from data, not from demographics, but from the fact that you're still here at this point in the conversation, which means something about the way your mind works. You are not someone who needs to be convinced that depth exists. You already knew that. You are not someone who is new to the idea that perception shapes experience. You've circled that territory before, probably more than once, probably through more than one framework, spiritual or psychological or philosophical. You have read things, you have thought carefully, you have had moments of genuine clarity that felt like they should have changed everything, and then watched, with a specific, quiet frustration, as the clarity faded and the familiar pattern reasserted itself. You are someone who understands well and changes slowly, and the gap between those two things, between how well you understand and how much has actually shifted, is not a character flaw. It is not evidence that you aren't trying hard enough, or that the ideas aren't real, or that transformation is something that happens to other people with simpler problems. It is evidence that understanding and changing are not the same operation. They use different mechanisms. They require different conditions. And the mechanism that produces real structural change in an observer is not more understanding. It is different experience. Experience that the existing observer cannot fully metabolize back into its current categories. Experience that creates what psychologists call a schema-incongruent event, something that doesn't fit, that can't be quietly routed around, that sits in the system and demands a reorganization rather than a reinterpretation. You cannot think your way to a different observer. You have to live your way there. Which means the question is not, do I understand this? You do. The question is, what experience am I willing to have that my current observer would not predict, would not select for, would not know how to absorb without changing in the process? What are you willing to look at differently, not as a thought experiment, but as an actual choice about where your attention goes tomorrow morning, in the first minutes before the observer fully boots up and the day collapses into its familiar shape? Because that window exists. It is small. It closes quickly. But it is real. The moments just after waking, before the predictive apparatus has fully engaged, before the day's expected shape has been confirmed by the first check of the phone or the first familiar thought, those moments are genuinely superposed. The observer hasn't fully collapsed the day yet. Multiple versions of it remain possible. What you do in that window, what you choose to look at, what you allow yourself to expect, what you let remain open rather than immediately resolving into the known, is not a spiritual practice in the mystical sense. It is a structural intervention in the measurement apparatus. Small, incremental, cumulative over time in ways that don't announce themselves dramatically, but that shift, gradually and then suddenly, the range of what your observer is capable of allowing through. This is not a technique being sold to you. It is a logical consequence of everything the physics, the philosophy, and the psychology have been pointing toward throughout this entire conversation. The observer can change, but only through repeated contact with experience. It cannot collapse back into the old pattern. And that contact has to be chosen deliberately against the resistance of the existing observer, which will frame every such choice as unnecessary, uncomfortable, or naive. The old observer will call growth a mistake. That is not a reason to stop. It is the most reliable sign that you are moving in the right direction. Now there's one more thing that needs to be said. The thing that closes the loop. This conversation opened at the very beginning. And it requires going back to where we started, which is also, it turns out, where we've been all along. We started with a question. What if the most dangerous thing you do every day is look? And the answer, the real one, not the comfortable version, is that it depends entirely on what the observer doing the looking has been trained to find. The physics was never really about particles. The double-slit experiment, Wheeler's delayed choice, the von Neumann chain, these weren't detours into scientific territory that had nothing to do with your life. They were a map, a precise, mathematically grounded description of something that has been operating in your experience since long before you had words for it. Reality is not fixed and then perceived. It is perceived and thereby fixed. And the instrument of that fixing, the observer that has been collapsing your days, your relationships, your sense of what's possible, your understanding of who you are, was assembled in conditions you didn't choose, from materials you didn't select, according to a blueprint you were never shown. It was handed to you as a self, you wore it as a self. And for a long time, because it was the only instrument available, it was indistinguishable from reality itself. That is not your fault. But it is now, having seen it clearly, your responsibility. Not in the heavy moralistic sense, in the precise structural sense. Responsibility here means response-ability, the capacity to respond differently, now that the mechanism is visible, to the open field of possibility that exists before the observer collapses it. The observer was never the enemy. The unconscious observation was. This is the distinction that everything in this conversation has been building toward, and it's worth staying with it for a moment rather than moving past it too quickly. The observer itself, the fact that you are a conscious being who collapses reality through the act of looking, is not a problem to be solved. It is the fundamental feature of what you are. Wheeler's participatory universe doesn't describe a flaw in consciousness. It describes consciousness as the mechanism through which the universe becomes specific, becomes actual, becomes real in the experiential sense rather than merely probable in the mathematical one. You are not broken for having an observer. You are broken, in the specific repairable sense, only insofar as the observer has been running unconsciously, selecting automatically, collapsing possibility into pattern without your knowledge or consent. The moment you see it, really see it not as an interesting idea but as a structural fact about your own experience, something changes. Not everything, not immediately, not without the continued effort of choosing different experience against the resistance of the old pattern. But something, the superposition which the old observer had been collapsing prematurely for years, opens slightly. The interference pattern, the wide wave-like spread of what's actually possible for someone with your history and your intelligence and your particular capacity for this kind of depth, begins to reassert itself. Not because you thought your way there, because you looked differently. And here is the payoff that the entire conversation has been building toward, the thing that the physics and the philosophy and the psychology all point to when you follow them far enough without flinching. The most important observer you will ever recalibrate is not the one you bring to your career or your relationships or your understanding of the world. It is the one you bring to yourself, because every other observation flows from that one. The way you observe your own capacity determines what capacities you develop. The way you observe your own history determines what that history means and what it therefore permits. The way you observe yourself in the quiet moments before the day has fully collapsed determines the entire shape of what the day becomes. Wheeler said the past has no existence except as it is recorded in the present, which means the story of who you have been, the record of what your observer has been selecting all these years, is not a fixed document. It is a living measurement, and measurements, as we have established, are not separate from the observer making them. You can recollapse the past, not its facts, its meaning. And meaning is everything. Meaning is the difference between a history that foreclosed and a history that instructs, between a pattern that defines and a pattern that informs, between an observer locked into what it was built to see and an observer that has become, gradually, deliberately, against resistance, capable of seeing what was always there but never allowed through. That is not a small thing. That is, in the most literal sense available to us, a shift in reality. Not the reality of particles and wave functions, though the physics, as we've seen, is not entirely silent on the matter. The reality of your actual lived experience. The reality of what collapses into specificity each morning, when the observer boots up and the day begins. The reality of what you find when you look at your circumstances, at your relationships, at the face in the mirror, at the open field of what remains possible for someone who has arrived at this point in their life with this particular depth of understanding and this particular willingness to look honestly at the instrument doing the looking. That reality is not fixed. It never was. It was always waiting for a different observer. And here is the closing of the loop that opened at the very beginning of this conversation, the one about what you were collapsing each morning before you fully understood that collapsing was what you were doing. The terrifying quantum observer theory that shifts reality isn't terrifying because it suggests you've been doing something wrong. It's terrifying because it suggests you've been doing something consequential, with full structural power and zero conscious awareness. That the choices were always yours, that the instrument was always yours, that the reality being produced was never happening to you from outside. It was being produced by you, from inside, through the most ordinary and continuous act available to a conscious being. The act of looking. And the shift, the one the title of this video promised, the one the physics points toward, the one that Kant and Wheeler and William James and every serious investigator of consciousness eventually arrives at from their different directions, is not a dramatic rupture. It is not an enlightenment event. It is not a technique or a practice or a system. It is a moment of recognition. The recognition that you are the observer, that you are always the observer. That the world you have been inhabiting is, in some irreducible and measurable sense, the world your observer has been selecting, and that the observer, the instrument, the apparatus, the measurement device assembled from everything you've lived through, is not fixed. It is, like every quantum system before the measurement is made, still open, still in superposition, still capable of collapsing into something you haven't seen yet. If this conversation landed somewhere real for you, not just intellectually, but in the specific place where understanding and experience meet, then the most useful thing you can do right now is not to share it or save it or return to it later when you have more time. The most useful thing is to sit with the question it opened, not to answer it, not yet. Just to let it remain open, the way a particle remains in superposition before the measurement is made. To resist the observer's instinct to collapse it immediately into a familiar category. Interesting video. Something to think about. I already knew this. And instead, let it do what genuine questions do when they're allowed to. Let it look back. Because the question this video has really been asking, beneath the physics, beneath the philosophy, beneath the structure of what observation is and what it does, is a single, personal, irreducible question. Who would you be if your observer had been built differently? Not who you wish you were, not who you're trying to become, who you actually would be, the specific, concrete, lived version of you that would have emerged from the same history, the same intelligence, the same depth, but with a measurement apparatus calibrated toward openness rather than confirmation. That person is not hypothetical. That person is the superposition you haven't collapsed yet. If you want to continue this investigation into consciousness, into the structure of perception, into what it actually means to change at the level of the observer rather than just the behavior, there's more here. The next conversation goes deeper into the mechanism, into what new experience actually looks like when the old observer is running, and how to recognize the moments when the apparatus is open enough to be reconfigured. But that's for next time. For now, if something in this conversation moved something in you, leave it in the comments. Not a summary of what you learned, the question it left you with, the specific thing that didn't collapse back into the familiar way most things do. Those questions are the interference pattern. They're the sign that something is still in superposition, still open, still unresolved, still capable of becoming something your current observer hasn't predicted. And that is exactly where you want to be. The most dangerous thing you do every day is look. Make it count.